Mhm. We're live. Okay, hello everyone. Hello to all the conference attendees. Thank you for being here. This is our third day of the conference, and we welcome Nicolas Miailhe. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Marta, for having me. And congratulations to all of you for this wonderful conference. I know we're towards the end or across half of it.
Yeah, more than half, yeah.
Well done, well done. It's important. It's a good job, an important job to be done to gather more, interest and attention around the topics of AI governance and ethics.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to introduce Nicolas and his work, and then I'm going to leave the floor to him. His presentation is going to take around 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So please do feel free from GatherTown to share your questions in the chat. And as usual, we will report them to Nicolas, to our keynote speaker, and we're going to be able to have a Q&A session. But let's begin. So Nicolas Miailhe co-founded the Future Society in 2014 and originally incubated it at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Incorporated as a nonprofit independent think tank, TFS specializes in questions of impact and governance of AI. A recognized strategist, thought leader, and implementer, Nicolas has lectured around the world and advises governments, international organizations, philanthropies, and multinationals. He's an appointed expert to the Global Partnership on AI, where he co-chairs the Committee on Climate Action and Biodiversity Preservation, to the AI Group of Experts at OECD, and to the Global Council on Extended Intelligence, among others. Nicolas teaches at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, and he's also a member of 3 committees of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethically Aligned Design of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, and a fellow with the Center for the Governance of Change at IE Business School in Madrid. Today, Nicolas is going to talk to us about taking stock of current advances and challenges in the global governance of AI. Nicolas, the floor to you. Go ahead with your presentation.
Right, thanks a lot, Marta. And maybe let me share my screen. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's loading now.
Loading.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. I can't see you because I'm being streamlined through Zoom. So I know you're on a different platform, and congrats on producing that because it's never easy. And there are often glitches, so well done on that, for people team. So I'm going to try and cover a bit of a ground today in terms of taking stock of where we are in terms of governing the rise of AI from a global perspective. First, who are we and from which perspective am I talking? Thanks for the intro, Marta. What is TFS? Well, we are an independent AI policy think tank. What we try and really help develop is this set of AI governance frameworks, tools, and protocols, and work with with policymakers around the world, particularly at an international and global level, to forge them in a way that it allows interoperability, because without interoperability, you don't have investment and trade, which is important. I was born and raised in France at a time where there was still a wall across Berlin. And I'm afraid that in decades to come, the walls are going to go straight through our heads, through the metaverse or other things. That's why interoperable frameworks and protocols is going to be important in the future for us to do business in an ethical and responsible way. Well, as Marta says, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Started in 2014 at the Kennedy School. We are now an independent 501c3. And we work with a number of international organizations, including, as you said, Global Partnership on AI, OECD, UNESCO, World Bank, GIZ, and many others, and many governments. We also, though we are independent from business, we work a lot with businesses. It's very important because at the end of the day, the adoption of AI is done primarily, not exclusively, but primarily through them and through particularly industrial players. So it's important to also understand and work with them, and especially not exclusively with big tech. Big tech have a dominating position. So we've been talking, and I teach in my class a question of an asymmetric oligopolistic model to refer to the fact that big tech is dominating over nation state on the standards of adoption of AI. But think about all the others, blue chip companies which will need to adopt, and think about all the SMEs. It's at that stage too, at that level, that we have to work. Well, what are we grappling with, or what are we trying to grapple with at TFS? Well, the key framework is one that you have heard about, I'm sure, is that we're at a stage where we are moving from principles of AI governance to practices of AI governance, moving from principles to practice. And what do we mean by that at the global governance level? But first, it means trying, and it's hard, to reconcile in practice challenges of responsible adoption that pertains to the end of the day, to development, access to basic services, sustainable development goals, that pertains to the end of the month, questions of employment, questions of ethics, fairness, biases, and question of the end of the world, question of potential AI safety, artificial general intelligence in the future, and trying to reconcile them, because the way in which we build AI today is going to influence the way in which we let it grow tomorrow, obviously. And the way in which we're building it today is built upon, I would say, socio-technical imaginary constructs, practices that come from the past. AI, as a term, was coined in the 50s out of an academic conference that took place at Dartmouth, but out of an intent to also convince the Department of Defense to get more credit. So these terms are loaded, and I, for one, I'm in favor of, that may surprise you, but at an academic level, burying the notion of AI. I think it's time to go to Dartmouth for a second Dartmouth conference, where we would bury the notion of AI and see the rise of a new concept from a solid academic perspective that would be more, I would say, adapted to the complexity of the socio-technical phenomena we have to deal with. Artificial intelligence is fraught with confusions between intelligence and autonomy, is premised on a form of worshipping of anthropomorphism, is not at all anchored into the political economy of the digital revolution from which it falls, or out of which it emerges, rather. So I'm in favor of going to bury AI to look at something that, I don't know, collective intelligence, it's cell intelligence. It's about intelligence, but intelligence itself is a polysemic word. It's there in central intelligence agency, which does not necessarily refer to like human intelligence and more to surveillance. So that's why it's and so moving from principles to practice also means trying to square up or to align in practice, again, not in concept, not theoretically, in practice, the environmental and digital transformation. Because we live in a climate emergency and we're just out of the COP'26, which has delivered disappointing results. And so there is huge risk of, again, falling into the trap of techno-solutionism. When I, for example, read to the latest post, DeepMind, claiming and saying with sincerity, with honesty, with great talent that they want to pursue in the future AGI for nuclear fusion or AGI for climate action, I am both enthused and worried. Because when I read AGI for nuclear fusion, my mind also reads, oh, here comes techno-solutionism squared. And we have to be careful about these things, because there is so much of a climate emergency that we are going to be drawn to techno-solutionism. And we know that the rise of AI is increasingly being called and demanded as responsible, because it is putting in question some almost fundamental values in terms of freedom, in terms of equality, and in terms of democracy. And if we are to uphold the rule of law, advance human rights, defend our democratic order, we need to be careful in the ways in which we square up, we align the environmental and the digital revolutions. Do we want tomorrow that on our phones we have an AI-powered CO2 emission monitoring app that would help you and me to benefit from tax breaks as you satisfy a smart contract in reducing over a period of 5 years your emissions? Yes, maybe, so long as it does not demolishes free will, privacy, democracy, and does not entrench more and more the inequalities. You've seen, as I have, all the explosion of inequalities with the rise of cryptocurrencies, like crypto billionaires. I mean, that's also a problem. It also, moving from principles to practice, means trying to reconcile, again, in practice, big ideals of universalism versus pluralism, the global versus the local, and try and reconcile and acknowledge the needed differences between civilizations across civilizations. That's more easily said than done. This week, hopefully, UNESCO will adopt at its general conference a standard setting instrument. In other words, a declaration on AI ethics principles and the way in which they can be implemented, which would have been signed by over 160 countries. Not easy to do, not easy at all to do. Because within these countries, you've got democracies, but you have non-democracies. You've got cultures where fundamental rights, where liberalism, fundamental rights is really at the center, and cultures where it's not. And so trying to articulate fundamental rights vis-a-vis ethics, fundamental rights vis-a-vis ethics understood as moral philosophy, is not easily done in practice, because some would want to use moral philosophy to undermine fundamental rights. So doing that is not easy in practice. And yet, if we don't do it, we run the risk tomorrow of being not necessarily accused, but attacked over accusations of ethics imperialism. Because again, pluralism is about respecting local cultures and empowering them to adopt technologies responsibly. And we will have failed if in 15 years, for example, in Africa, European and Westerns, and even in Chinese are attacked of lesser risk, you would agree with me, that are accused of ethics imperialism. And last but not the least, what we're grappling with is the need to build reflexively evidence-based approach. In other words, evidence-based approach to find the right kind of cocktails of self, soft, and hard regulation. We know out of Francis Hogus, out of other whistleblowers, of the abuses that we've seen of big tech, that self-regulation itself won't cut it. And we know that soft norms are also needed in terms of standards for auditing, for certification, for many other practices across many other professional bodies and professional committees. We know that soft norms are needed, but we also know that hard regulation, hard norms, law, legislation will be needed to tame the beast and to deal with the attack on our democracy, attack on rule of law, attack on inequalities. And it's about finding the right cocktail. We know that regulations, legislation take time to mature and are not agile. So the more actors take and exercise their own social responsibility in terms of self-regulation, the smarter the soft norms and the smarter the hard norms. I'll give you an example. Do we really want the forthcoming EU AI Act to specify in detail a standard over third-party auditing of high-risk AI applications? Not necessarily. Why? Because the moment it is there for as long as the act is going to be law. And we know that it takes time for Europe to believably deliver law. So do we want rather that this legislation should mention state-of-the-art standards of certification and delegate to other organizations, in this case, Sensenelec, the duty of maturing and overhauling and reforming these. But then, if these exist and are not adopted by companies, it has no impact. That's why it's really soft, self and hard regulation mechanisms and cocktails. And evidence-based mechanisms that need to be developed pertain, for example, to the realm of metrology. I'll speak later about the underinvested realm of metrology. And why I speak about the underinvested realm of metrology is because, take an example, large language models or deep reinforcement learning models with hundreds of billions of parameters. If we are to deliver on them on questions of fairness, questions of transparency and explainability, we will have for sure to benchmark them on their performances. And it's not, forget about explainability for now, but simply benchmarking several large language models at a metrological perspective with software probing won't be easy to be done. Capacity building, an enormous capacity building effort is going to be needed. And hopefully not only in the US, a bit in Europe, hopefully tomorrow, the African Union and others are going to be equipped with these capacities, through which only they can exercise and realize their values and their identities. Otherwise, we should be prepared to face resurgence of nationalism, because some countries are going to feel attacked in their values. In many ways, the populist wave that has swept across America, that is sweeping across Europe, is a manifestation of people are afraid. They fear that they are losing their identity. They blame it a lot on migrants. They have not blamed it too much on technology. It's starting with techlash, but that's what we mean by that. Evidence-based and reflexively. It's not easy. Next events from the Future Society, which I invite you all to, will happen on the 6th and the 7th of December. 7th is missing from the slide, but it's very much there. You can find everything you need on that at the following website, aiathens.org. The name of the event is the Athens Roundtable on AI and the Rule of Law. This year it's co-hosted with UNESCO, with the Council of Europe, with the European Parliament, with the National Judicial College, with IEEE, with Duke, with many others. And it's really an event where we try and address, in practice, the questions I just outlined before. And we'll have a number of ministerial speakers, practitioners, not enough academics, but we can always do better. And it's really trying to advance what I call the institutionalization of standards, certification, accreditation, policy frameworks, and stakeholder education on that. On this occasion, for example, we are going to announce or launch formally a MOOC, a massively open online course that we have been developing with UNESCO, with IEEE, with CETIC in Brazil, and with the National Judicial College on AI and the rule of law, targeting judicial operators, judges, prosecutors, lawyers, clerks, to try and help equipping them with better understanding of and tools to navigate. It's not a training, it's more educational. We call it training with more education. So it's general understanding of what AI and the rule of law means in terms of opportunities and in terms of risk. There will be many other things, many other working groups. Join us, speak about it around you. It's available to and open to all, and it's going to be quite interesting. It's the 3rd edition. And why Athens? Well, Athens, in a big part, is where democracy was invented with all its flaws. It's in a large part when you address AI and the rule of law in democracy under the patronage, it's under the patronage of the president of the Hellenic Republic. So it's high level, it's head of state. And but when you speak about AI and democracy under the Acropolis, under the Parthenon, trust me, you tend to try and reflect and be a bit more reflexive. So it's a country and it's a civilization that is supposed to be instigating reflection, reflexivity, in terms of how do we build responsible AI and how do we address the other challenges I've mentioned before. I know you've had a keynote by my colleague and friend Priya Danti. One of the things that I've been particularly invested over the past year in my role as the co-chair of the Committee on Climate Action and Biodiversity Preservation has been developing that report that has been presented at the COP'26, which is an expression of an underinvested area where responsibility has to unfold. It's in the field of climate action, as I said before. So read the report, Climate Action and AI, Recommendations for Government Action, commissioned by GPA, written by the Center for Climate and Climate Change AI. And Priya played a big role in that team. That's and the kind of areas we try to cover range from well, data and digital infrastructure, research, innovation and funding, deployment and system integration, reducing AI negative impact on the climate. What we mean by responsible AI in the field of climate action covers, of course, fairness, accountability, and transparency, but we should also cover questions of the negative impact of AI on the environment. And again, there you understand what I meant over evidence-based instruments. Do we know scientifically what are the net zero performances or lack thereof of large language model? Not necessarily. And yet we need to be able to move there, to equip markets, to equip players with a way in which they can benchmark themselves. And we also address questions of, as I said, responsible AI, but capacity building, need for and pathways for international cooperation, and beyond energy consumption impact assessment. It's part of a project called Responsible AI Strategy for the Environment, which aims, as I said, to build a roadmap for responsible AI adoption for both climate action and biodiversity preservation in a way that is really anchored within the COP, work with IPCC, works with IPBS as we expand to biodiversity, and tries to really address and square up in practice ecological and digital transition as it pertains to AI in a reasonable way. Yeah, and we feel that typically, and we hope to be able in the future to explore the intersection between long-term AI and nuclear fusion through the control of magma or electromagnetic fields for magma, which is a big thing for nuclear fusion. But in so doing, we want to avoid what I said before, techno-solutionism square, because there is real potential, but at what time scale? Because if we fall into the trap of technology solutionism, we might land on bad choices in the short and midterms and overinvest in fusion while it might come much later in time, beyond 2050 or 60. That's why these questions of responsible AI in terms of how we try and understand the dynamics of AI are important to try to maximize the chance that we make the right choices in the short and in the midterm. And at the same time, some people are increasingly worried over the increase of capacities of large language models. So that's why it's important to have a science-driven, science-centric, but not exclusive of others processes for acquiring, developing this kind of knowledge. That's what the GPA as an IPCC for AI is. Now, I won't bore you with that, but don't forget, never forget that the AI revolution is really pushed, is really enabled by the convergence, the growing convergence between data and its governance, hardware, not only compute, but also networks and terminals, and algorithms which are not living in a vacuum. They are baked into software. Okay, it's and this gravitational pull, so to speak, is continuing. It doesn't stop. The moment we spend a lot of time on data, looking on the horizon, synthetic data, at the metaverse, at the one shot of future learning, we might underestimate or assess the fact that quantum computing may again change the full equation. Oh, 5G is coming. So this is a really and again on this algorithm and software, underestimate the value of the convergence between cryptocurrencies, or more generally distributed ledger technology, and foundation models or large language models. So that's ongoing. That's a high degree of complexity, which is for anyone very difficult to grapple with, and that's a problem. And not to even talk about what I call the cross-cutting enablers, which are typically underinvested, which are business models, especially talent and domain expertise, but particularly business model. We spend too much time on technology, not enough on business model to understand how technology percolates out of the lab into a startup, into market, into societies. And that's not over. We still have this problem of trying to assess where to look at when we look at AI because of a lack of a consolidated definition. And not to say that in the machine learning centric AI age that we live and we find ourselves in, the industrial value chains are not mature yet. Don't forget that they're being shaped. That's why there is a moment for governance. We can shape them to these cocktails of soft and hard regulation. That's what we're shaping to build a society of the future that we want, that is desirable, that tries and solve the other problems I mentioned at the beginning. What's happening against this background? Well, there is a growing set of international movement for policy. I think we've crossed, 70, but now over 70 countries have developed national AI strategies and mounting. We at TFS have supported Rwanda in developing its national AI strategy, are now starting to support Tunisia, and we hope to bring more African countries to the table, more global South countries to the table. But there is a movement where we have a growing set of countries developing and implementing AI strategies. That's a fact, and that's something we should, I think, celebrate. It's not enough, but it's happening. And the OECD, through its AI Policy Observatory, so far has played a pivotal role in trying to consolidate all that work. Not the only one, mind you, and they work in tandem with many others, including UNESCO, which I mentioned before, but the OECD. So pay attention and go to this website to try and understand, because it's an observatory that consolidates data streams over what are the instruments across a number of policy areas that you see here, from human resource, education, data governance, access to computing, transportation. It's really rich. It's a rich ecosystem. It's a rich environment, it's really OECD at its best, really building metrics, building evidence-based for policymaking. So spend some time there. I think it's worthwhile. OECD.ai. And number two, there's a mounting architecture of collaboration across international organizations on AI policy. Recently, these organizations, at the behest of OECD, UNESCO, and others, started the Global Policy.ai, which is a platform to help these international organizations coordinate and share best practices. And who do we have? Well, OECD, UNESCO, UN, World Bank, Inter-American Bank, EU, the FRA, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, European Commission, and the Council of Europe. I think this is great. It's mostly active at the working level, which is, in my view, exactly what is needed. which is people working in this organization, sharing knowledge, sharing best practices, avoiding turf wars, avoiding competition on their mandate, and trying to collaborate. It's something that CFS is supporting. It's not the end of everything, but that's a move in the right direction to avoid duplications and favor collaboration. And that's a symbol of this mounting architecture of cooperation on international or global governance of AI. What are some of the other trends of global governance? Well, as I said, we're moving from principles to practice. The OECD AI principles, which have been adopted by 37 countries and now even more, 42. So remember that the European Commission, high-level expert group on AI ethics, drafted also principles. Okay, but these principles, they're different, they're great, mind you, but they have not been adopted by nations. They have not been, they are the result of an independent group. The OECD AI principles are lighter, but they have gone through an intergovernmental process of approval. They have been approved by all the OECD members, and that's a big thing. That's important as a moral compass. So they are not being implemented, and it's tedious. It will take time. It's complicated, but it's happening through this OECD.ai structure, which I mentioned, the AI Policy Observatory. As I said, UNESCO is going hopefully to adopt this week, in the frame of the General Conference, their AI ethics global principle, and the kind of instruments and tools that we see emerge or we see being discussed include in the frameworks and protocols for independent auditing, conformity assessment, certification of AI systems. So there is in a way, a mounting toolbox of a responsible AI, including these questions of benchmarking and standardization for capacity monitoring. Definitely, it seems that Europe is at the center of hard regulation, and is the center of gravity of this global AI hard regulation. As you know, the European Commission is tabled in Parliament, the EU Parliament, the EU AI Act, which belongs to a wider family of acts: the Digital Services Act, the Markets Act, the Digital Governance Act, the Product Liability. So that's there's a mounting push on that. And the Council of Europe, which is not to be confused with the European Council, which is the European Union. Council of Europe has, I think, 47 member states, including Russia, for example, which is certainly not a member of the EU. This Council of Europe, out of work over the past 2 years, has embarked on a journey to develop a legally binding, in other words, an international treaty on AI and human rights. The EU AI Act and the wider family building on GDPR and this treaty are the only so far legally binding instrument internationally existing or about to exist on AI governance. The rest is soft norms, very important, but soft norms. Then we still have in a way, a US-China duopoly in terms of where the work really happens, where research, developments, they are really dwarfing Europe and the rest of the world. And one thing to say about China is that it's time to go beyond the stereotypes and the archetypes saying that China is state-driven, US is market-driven, and Europe is ethics-driven, which does not mean much. And realize that even China is trying to, and doing a kind of exercise in standardization of its regulation by copying and pasting the best from GDPR and putting it into law in China to reassure investors and to create a level playing field. It's not that China is doing nothing in regulation. That's to be kept in mind. And US is delivering a huge push on large investments with plans and not a minimal not a big regulation, but minimal areas of regulation. I'll give you an example. If you have attended the Stanford High conference on radical policy ideas, you would have listened to Eric Lander, the scientific advisor to US president and head of OSTP, who's gained a cabinet rank. It's the first time that the head of OSTP is cabinet rank now. And he was talking about the project that his office is leading, which is, as you've heard, I guess, the AI Bill of Rights. White House trying to set in motion a soft norm instrument to delineate what AI means in terms of a Bill of Rights for questions of fairness, accountability, transparency, and explainability. I really encourage you to go and watch his talk. You'll understand what that means. You see, that's not hard regulation, that's soft regulation. It's powerful soft regulation. And as you've seen through Congress, like big investment packages have been passed that include investment in AI. So America is really pushing in that race against China for more investment and adoption. And there's a mounting wave, though timid, but mounting, of bilateral and multilateral donor agency in Africa. We've seen IDRC, the Canadian, GIZ, Fair Forward, very active, and with the Smart Africa Partnership led out of and the Broadband Commission of the UN, and I mentioned before work in Rwanda, Tunisia, but there's also Ghana and others. So there's a mounting wave of investment adoption, which is going to be promising to bring in practice more diversity and inclusion in the global governance of AI conversation. Never forget how are we doing on time, Marta?
You're good. We are like at 32, but that's perfect. Like you can take your time. I think as long as it's 35 or 40 minutes, we're still very good. That's what all the other speakers did as well. So
okay, so I'll try and go so that we can get into a conversation, which is we all know more interesting. Never forget, since AI is a social technical imaginary, never forget that a few use case anchor the entire conversation in political economy. So yes, facial recognition technology as a use case and biometrics in general, which come from a long distance, even before AI was AI, is going to continue to play a key role, as is and will continue to play a key role to anchor and define the conversation. It's the same in the global south for questions of access to credit, algorithmic lending. If we can solve the problem of microfinance with AI, why not? Self-driving cars, of course, and little autonomous weapon systems. They are not the only ones, but these ones really anchor and use cases are like in the thousands. But trust me, not 1,000 use cases are going to be considered as anchored for the regulation. Only a handful. This I mentioned. Important for those of you who are interested in, well, ethics, but also in science and technology studies, functionalism and a risk-based approach are increasingly foundational in the emerging global governance of AI regime. That's, I think, very well exemplified by the draft EU AI Act, which is really premised on the risk-based approach, defining even a pyramid that you can see here that ranges from unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risks. There are normative choices bound into this way of expressing that risk-based approach. The OECD AI principle is also risk-based. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but it's that's a defining feature, and it's increasingly functionalist. We're trying to look at use cases. We're trying to look at ways in which we're talking about an automatic decision-making system or an aid-to-decision system, and the kind of function that AI discharge. And this functionalist approach applies to some of the superstar tools within the emerging toolbox, including third-party auditing, which is increasingly being talked about. As I said, there is an underinvested field for AI governance, ethics, and for research on that, which is the field of measurement. NIST in the US is playing a big role under the Department of Commerce, also deploying a risk-based framework, but NIST is very well done for its ability to lead benchmarking programs to create a better understanding as to who is performing against what in the field of AI, in the field of facial recognition, in the field of a number of fields. But its benchmarking studies are famous, and you have standardization bodies such as IEEE and Sensenec in Europe, doing, I would say, work of trying to standardize and create certification pathways, benchmarking pathways, and that's a big field. A lot of power is there in measurement. If you cannot, in metrology, if you cannot measure it, you don't know much about it. If you can measure it, you can affect it quite a lot and understand. And finally, I think we're still in an age of unresolved dynamics or unresolved definition and dynamics of AI. For some, that's why I mentioned DeepMind, they're still in the age of should we define narrow AI versus general intelligence? For some, it's worse debunking. It doesn't exist. AGI has never existed, and will never exist. So now we need to deconstruct these frontiers of the dynamics of AI and its progress over the long term, and do that too at a time where, that's why I quoted the Center for Research on Foundation Models. There are attempts, in this case from Stanford, to redefine the notion of AI, narrow versus general, around this notion of foundational, to try and provide a conceptual framework around large language models. And then there is the reality on the ground of AI as it is being adopted today, and the fight between TensorFlow from Google and PyTorch from Facebook. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there were many other libraries of development of AI. We are left with 2 now. And I think that Stanford a few weeks ago announced that they were selecting PyTorch, over which Google with TensorFlow was not very happy. So there is a huge concentration. And if we are tomorrow, for example, to deliver on the promise of data-centric AI, which is a model by means of which we try and be more reflexive in terms of across the pipeline of data, from acquisition to sculpting, to try and better render manifest our ability to deal with biases. We need these libraries in the tools that they offer to be adapted with that. We need machine learning ops, ML ops, to be, in terms of its best practices, its standards, to be aligned with the ability to retrieve and better understand the relative weight of one parameter in a large language model. And that's why this political economy of machine learning ops and the concentration around Google TensorFlow and Facebook PyTorch is important to keep in mind and not get too much mystified away from them. We need to look at where adoption is happening. I'll stop there and we can get into a conversation.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Great presentation. We have already had like a lot of questions coming in as you were talking. So we have already a host of things to ask from the audience. Should I start?
Yeah, please do.
First thing first, general question. How would you define intelligence and how would you carry this definition to a new AI? Do you think is accurate to call it intelligent? I think this referred to the very beginning of your presentation.
Yeah. I think I've been going around since I think 2018, saying something which is now a bit mainstream, which is the following. It's neither artificial nor intelligent. It's powerful and collective. And that's the problem with the concept of AI. We're talking about things which have neither, in my view, intelligence, nor sentience, and nor consciousness, which is a package, and then it can be debated, which is probably reserved for life forms to be debated. But for sure, these things are not conscious and not sentient, and they don't exhibit a lot of intelligence. It's really powerful. It's big data-driven machine learning algorithmic system running on high performance computers, and we're throwing more and more compute at stupid algorithms. So it's stupid algorithm, but powerful, capable of delivering huge performances on a few tasks related to optimization and prediction beyond human capacity. So that's yeah, and it's not artificial because who programs those algorithms? Who parameters them? Who interpret them? Who acts within the realms of interpretation? There is a human in the loop, and even there's less and less human, but there's still human in the loop. So it's really not artificial. It's collective. That's why a part of those who want to go and bury the notion of AI and see the rise of an alternative concept, we need to still use AI in the frame of our operations and activities. But in my view, the responsibility of academia is to start today working on an alternative concept. And there are works going on there, mind you, but really try and look at, well, cognitive sciences, neurobiology, sociology, really interdisciplinary, to try and come up with a concept that can help us as societies govern this phenomena with the complexity that we deserve. Because artificial intelligence, it's a minefield, it's a problem. It's just do away with it.
I think the invite is well taken as part of this conference. Half of it, in fact, is also academic, and we've had several paper sessions actually addressing this point, and also several of the attendees that brought up the idea of not necessarily an even anthropocentric sort of idea of intelligence and AI that also feeds into potentially what you're referring to when you say let's invite academia to find other conceptions of AI to get out of this very basic and yet too general, confusing term. So yeah, they hear you, hopefully, people in the audience. We have a second one. That's a very tough one, I believe. Do you believe AI can help reducing world inequalities? If yes, how? Do you know any practical example?
Oh, yes, of course. I think AI can support reduction of inequalities. I'll give an example. The fight against tax evasion. Can we, and I know it's sensitive because it's also privacy. Can we enable algorithms to profile better the potential strategies followed by 0.1% of fiscal evasion to be able to deal with it and bring them back into the realm of law? Of course we can. Can we use AI and AI modeling and simulations through new generation digital twins to try and better model macroeconomic policy and the efficacy of some of the macroeconomic tools we deploy. We make a lot of assumptions. We know these models are fraud, and that's why, emerge from the ground of development, but now applied in Europe and in the North, this notion of randomized controlled trials. If you look at the core of it, within the field of behavioral science, the field of the example of randomized controlled trials is an example where AI and more acute modeling can really help us understand on the ground the effect or lack of effect of some of our policy options. So yeah, absolutely. I hope these are two examples that strike a chord. But yes, it depends on what we do with it. That's why when you look at the AI, that's why in academia, do not fear. You are within a community that has the expertise, should have the ethics, that has the competence to really use these AI tools to advance science. AI for science is an extremely promising area. What becomes more difficult is when we either when science monopolizes it or when we take it out of the lab too quickly. I'll give you an example. Loomis case, US, Wisconsin. A judge, which has, why we're doing AI and a rule of law and attends round table, we need judicial operators to be equipped with the competence needed to manipulate these black boxes in a way that does not discriminate further. And for want of competence, we're handing over in the hands of people who don't have time. Remember, they have so many cases to, this tool, great. Okay, now you go back to jail. Your risk is too high. What do you mean? I mean, what's the baseline? That's why it's important to, but in science, for political science 2.0, I think has a big role to play, so long as you do not fall into the worshipping of AI, into anthropomorphism, into anthropocentrism. But definitely, mind you.
Yeah, and thank you also for bringing up concrete examples. So true. And now we have another question that I think also refers to something you touched briefly upon in your presentation. The EU has recently issued the Digital Services Act package, which shifts from an ex post to an ex ante approach to the regulation of digital platforms. Do you think this is the right approach considering the nature of digital markets? In your view, how can this approach affect innovation?
All right, so it's a big question.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about it. Because DMA has not yet been approved. Okay, it is a proposal has been issued by European Commission. It's tabled at the European Parliament, and then we'll go into a trilogue, meaning the European Council, meaning nation state, will have to give their opinion on that. Yes, indeed, the DMA. I'm not an expert. The DSA. I'm not an expert on DSA. The DSA is putting an obligation of third-party auditing on the platforms. And I think that this is a great thing to do. Why? Because as much as we may differ, and we do differ across Europe in our definitions of freedom of expression versus hate speech, and our definitions of neutrality of platforms, I think we need to get better at understanding what really happens on these platforms and how neutral these actors are, including from human-led content management to algorithmic-led content management. We need to have better transparency. And that's, I think, the great added value of Frances Hauger's whistleblowing, saying, okay, in the case of France, because I'm French, do you know actually how many content moderators are employed or contracted by Facebook who speak French?
I have no idea.
Me neither. Should we know a bit better about that?
Yeah.
So as part of third-party audit, maybe we could audit the ways in which, from a media perspective, like I'll give you like an alternative example so that you know from which perspective I'm talking. We in France, or people in Chile, or people in Italy have recently gone through a cycle of election campaign. In France, it's a presidential campaign. In Chile, it's a presidential campaign. It's the highest point of power. In the frame of a campaign, trust me, if a TV channel or if a radio channel, as a matter of fact, one of our candidates, or not yet declared candidates, potential candidates, has recently been sentenced to pay a fine because of hate speech on TV. If as a TV channel or radio channel, you indulge into hate speech, there is a regulator in France called le Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel, TV and radio regulator, who comes on you and has fining power, can stop your services. Trust me, you listen. Trust me, you listen very carefully to what they say. If we stop talking about social networks, as we speak about in France, and more about social media, then immediately the question of regulation comes up. Then it's a complicated question to solve, not an easy one, because we have differing across Europe a vision of hate speech versus freedom of expression. But can we agree on benchmarking and a few third-party auditing protocol to at least know what's going on? Even the companies are asking for it now. And I think that it can be, to the third part of the question vis-a-vis innovation, it can be an enormous, I would say, potential for innovation. Why? Because an ecosystem of third-party auditing out of DSA can emerge in the particular use case of social media, but can be applied across the field of AI. Third-party auditing, as you've seen, is a toolbox. Here is we keep on saying that regulation is backward, it's not backwards, but is late. You know, the law is lagging technology. Well, in this case, potentially DSA could leapfrog, where using the problem of social media, we could create a small ecosystem, a market incentive around third-party audit that could apply backwards across the board. Ask some of the activists of the Black Lives Matter movements in the US what they think about DSA from that perspective, in terms of minimizing algorithmic biases and certain systems. But the US Congress is incapable of passing it because it's paralyzed. So that's why I think it's potentially very, very promising. The problem, as always, is that since Europe is so, I would say, weak industrially on digital economy and AI, they run the risk of passing laws without materiality. Give an example. GDPR enshrines the right to portability, data portability. This right is not rendered manifest today because there is no protocol. Data trusts don't exist. Data cooperative don't exist. As a result, the big fight between, what do you mean your data is portable? The picture I publish or the like I gave you? What is mine? What is yours? What do I control? As a result, not much happens. So it's very, remember what I said, soft and hard regulatory mechanisms. Otherwise, you might, as a legislator, have the courage to mandate a requirement that has no reality, no materiality out of lack of practices. And I hope that DSA will be accompanied by a solid industrial policy, solid innovation policy to render, as an example, the requirement of third-party auditing manifest in material in its existence.
Thank you so much. Very exhaustive reply, very, very clear. We have another one, which is, and I think this is also in reference to part of your presentation when you talked about your work with Priya Donti from Climate Change AI, who was here as well. So, and she said hi to you as well. Just
I say to Priya, hey Priya.
And so probably the biggest priority for governments globally now is climate change. Where and how, if at all, do you see the role of AI governance in this? Can AI help, or will it exacerbate, as you said as well, current climate problems?
Well, it seems that you did not listen to my presentation, but I repeat a few things. Yes, let me go back to the slides, because I think that's important. Can you see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, as I said, moving from principles to practice in AI governance requires, among other, aligning, combining, squaring up, in practice, the ecological, meaning climate action and biodiversity preservation, revolution and transition, and the digital transition. There is a climate emergency, so we are going to demand more and more from AI. That's why DeepMind is saying, okay, why not use AGI to work on nuclear fusion? Because we could solve energy and move beyond dirty, small-scale nuclear fission reactor or fossil fuel. Is the potential there? Yes, of course. But it's on us to make sure that the way in which we combine the ecological and the digital revolution does not lead to sacrificing the best from our liberal, social, and democratic values. As I said, do we want to empower consumers with data trust, with third-party audit, with mechanisms through their phone by means of which they can monitor their CO2 emission reduction action by doing XYZ? I think we won't, except if it's at the cost of privacy, except if it attacks free will or civil liberties, except if it exacerbates equalities by creating another big bubble for crypto billionaires. Okay, I think that's the more. So yes, and why at TFS we decided to get invested involved, leading the work of GPay on climate action and biodiversity preservation, because of the climate emergency, there is going to be a demand from society for cutting corners for quick fixes, for techno-solutionism. Solve it now. Well, I'm sorry. AI is only a small part of the problem. We will have to change behaviors. Our goal, our role is to create the boundary. I mean, create the better understand what is it a good solution for, what is it a bad solution for, what is it risky for privacy, what is not, to create a roadmap for governments to basically adopt responsible AI for climate action in a way that is responsible. As I said, it's very important. That's and it's because of the climate emergency, there is so many incentives to cut corners.
Yeah, thank you so much for the clarification and for bringing back the slides.
And that's for read the report.
That, yeah.
Climate change and AI recommendations for government action. You'll see why I say that, because you'll see their use cases, 10 or 12 of them. A bouquet of 49 recommendations which go in detail. They don't go in detail enough. What we're going to take this forward is defining how you implement that in terms of the who, the when, the how much. It's because not everything is, what do you mean by governments? What, independent regulators, local authorities? What do you mean by that? And so that's, and then we're going to expand to reconciling with biodiversity preservation, which is another big thing. Do we want climate action at the cost of the extension of billions of species? Not necessarily. We all love nature.
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much. Priya also cited this report, and I invite everyone in the audience to have a look at it as well. There's another question, and I would like to add something to it as well, which says, how can Europe lead the AI revolution through regulation? And I would add to that, given what you presented today as well, do you think the AI Act, when it's going to be passed, when it's going to become into law, with all its timing that you talked about as well, do you think it's going to have a sort of like Brussels effect, as we saw in the GDPR, in the good and in the bad way, of course, or do you see it as something different from that?
What I'm afraid of is that, and I speak as a European, we as Europeans are creating global public goods in the form of legislations that become global standards that really help others like Americans, which are incapable of passing such legislation, but which are impacted. Facebook has made this a global gold standard. So we are running great services to incumbents and to existing powers, entrenching powers in China or in the US, but really not reviving our industrial capacity, really not investing in the future. Leading from a regulatory standpoint, that's what I said to the European Commission back in, what was this, 2019, and it summarizes my position. Europe should spend a little less time, not stop, but a little less time on trying to define the rules of the game, and try and spend a lot more time on mastering the arts of the game. Without industrial platforms leading the revolution on AI, we can publish bad regulation from a innovation versus regulation balance at the global level, and certainly not support our innovators, which have to pay this cost of compliance. So I think it's great it's a big bet, Europeans are brave and we're making a big bet on the long term. But because we're creating guardrails before the railroads, we have a moral obligation, a political obligation, and a livelihood for citizens obligation to immediately start on a big and efficient industrial package. And if you look back in the past 20 years, the European Commission in the how has not been so good at making sure that the billions pushed into the economy translate into the rise of economic industrial players. We don't have a solid and big enough capital market. We don't have an integrated capital market, and therefore we don't have solid IPOs or exit. They all go to the US. So we do all the hard work, and then someone picks them up and then makes money. No, we need to. So that's it's going to be hard. It's going to be very. That's why I say spend much more time on mastering the arts of the game and less time on the rules.
Yeah, totally. As we are as it's 55 already, I think I'll try to give you two questions that I find relatively similar to each other together, and you can address them as you like. So first one is, what would you advise to a young entrepreneur or policymaker who is interested about AI and wants to bring it into their business or policies, but falls behind the machine learning model that you described? And there's another question that is slightly different. In my experience, many technical people who work in AI are not very familiar with the ethical or regulatory problems of AI. On the other hand, many legislators may not be familiar with the more technical concepts of AI. How this gap can be narrowed, promoting a fruitful discussion between technical and non-technical people.
Bridging the tech policy gap, bringing the tech, I would say, marketing gap is extremely important. And has to, I don't think I need to explain a lot why it's so important, because otherwise we'll fail at the responsible AI adoption. Now, the question says how you do it.
Yeah.
I think part of the answer belongs to education at the, I would say, undergrad level and below at the high school level, trying to reform curriculums to, as early as it's feasible, incorporate some of the key conceptual frameworks that underpins the society of algorithmic system, the algorithmic thinking, and try and mature that into interdisciplinarity across high school and at university level. And creating to master's level, the right level of interdisciplinarity, both as selection criteria and outcome, desired outcome optimization functions, is going to be enormously important to land on, to render manifest interdisciplinarity. I'll end with a joke. Interdisciplinarity is going to be inherently difficult. Why? What is there in the world discipline? Well, the word discipline. You are being disciplined into a discipline. It's an order. And all of you know, and now, because you're young researchers and you see professors that, me as a sociologist, me as an anthropologist, me as a technologist, they express their discipline, which are enormously powerful and useful to create scientific knowledge. And when you try and go from one discipline to another, it's hard because you've been disciplined, because your identity, your ethos. So interdisciplinarity is an enormous challenge. And so for entrepreneurs, try and seek profiles that embed that embody that, and try and really create the intake. And for educators and universities, try and define programs that do that and recognize that it's hard, especially Oxford. Come on, it's going to be hard, but they're doing, I think, great work on that too, to try and transcend disciplines, not kill disciplines, transcend disciplines. That's the way to go. And a last piece on that.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a scientist and an engineer?
I have no idea. I don't want to say anything.
I'm not looking. There is no best answer, but what intuitively?
An engineer, I could say an engineer executes.
A scientist is tasked with the discovery or the construct, depending on where you stand on the philosophical spectrum, of new knowledge. An engineer, and these categories are blurred. I'm bringing archetypes. But for you to understand, I'm trying to answer your question, or whoever's question it was.
Yeah.
A scientist is tasked and passionate about the discovery of new knowledge. An engineer is tasked and passionate about taking that new knowledge into the world and solving problems with it. You engineer solutions. And that's why when we talk, we need to pay attention to these words. Is it science and technology? Is it technoscience? Who dominates? The engineer and the scientist. Now apply this matrix to AI. And remember what I said about Google PyTorch and Facebook, Facebook PyTorch or Google TensorFlow, or about the CERN and the Large Hadron Collider. So it's important to really try and build interdisciplinarity in terms of also how we solve the how and the what. And that we try and train, as an entrepreneur, try and look for engineers who are reflexive and who are willing to go back into knowledge. And as scientists, it's very important to be more reflexive and responsible in terms of where is that new knowledge leading us as a society? What kind of problems can we solve? Can't we solve? And that's what we've been trying to do with this report on AI and climate action.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's I think it's something that many of the attendees can bring back home as well. We're going to have scientists, but also potentially more practitioners and engineers in the audience. So that's something to take home. Now I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Nico, so much for being here. Really appreciate it a lot. If you have to run, please by any means do. I'm just going to run quickly through the program for tomorrow for the audience. But I want to thank you so much for being here today. And
thanks for having me. And congrats again to you and the team for putting together such a great event. Keep going. That's important, and have a good rest of the day, everyone. You take care.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye, Nico. And for everyone else, I'm just going to run quickly through the program of tomorrow. So this is what's going to follow. For today, this is it. Feel free to socialize in GatherTown, to take some time. We have a virtual bar, as you might know by now. We have some games as well that you can play. You can also just talk to other people. We saw these days that people had private spaces where they were interacting with each other. We also have the booth where people can get to know more about our sponsors. So feel free to go around and explore. But now, if you're tired, what's up for tomorrow instead? So tomorrow's theme of the day is ethics. And we're going to start with a paper session which is going to be representative of our academic core within our conference. And then we're going to have a break. And after that, we have a special lecture from artists who presented at the Biennale in Venice this very year. And it's a lecture on which is titled Catalog of the Post-Human. Please do come along if you're curious about art, if you're curious about technology, or if you're curious in general, please do come along. Then that's going to be followed by a workshop on AI ethics by Jessica Morley, a fellow researcher and a colleague of mine at the Oxford Internet Institute. And that is going to be followed by a roundtable on AI ethics, similar to the previous roundtables, and actually the last roundtable for our conference. And after a break, we're going to have a keynote of the day by Abhishek Gupta from the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. He's going to talk about AI ethics. And in fact, he's going to talk about the difficulties of bringing it from principles to practice, just as it has been anticipated by Nicolas Miailhe today here. I want to thank you all. It has been a long day. I wish you all a good evening, a good afternoon, a good morning, depending on where you are. And I'm going to stop the live now and see you tomorrow.